Joining us now is Brad Polumbo, the Deputy Opinion Contributors Editor for the Washington Examiner. So, Brad, I guess, had those elections yesterday. It didn't get the same kind of coverage that we usually talk about coming after Super Tuesday or Michigan, for example, especially since we don't know the results. But broadly speaking, about the idea to hold the elections yesterday, where do you stand on that issue?
Yeah, we haven't paid as much attention to the elections, and that's because we're in the midst of a global pandemic. But yeah, what we saw last night was that holding elections during a pandemic can be kind of a disaster. I mean, you had 3 hour long lines. In Milwaukee, you only had a handful of polling places open out of 180. You're going to have record low turnout. You have local officials questioning the legitimacy of the elections. Last night was an unmitigated disaster. But at the same time, I kind of feel bad for the people who are taking the heat for having it anyway, because what's the alternative? You know, this was not just a primary contest between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, which is a private party affair and can be postponed. You also had statewide official elections for a state Supreme Court seat and a mayoral position. You can't be canceling elections. I mean, that's really official U.S. elections being canceled would be a really grave thing indeed. So I think all we have seen is that you've got to do something different.
That's a really excellent point, because if you were to do that, as you were saying, postponing the elections, you're leaving people without leadership during this global pandemic. People don't have their local communities, municipalities, whatever it may be, to help make decisions or guide them through the different alternative routes that they have to come out of this pandemic. So that's a really good point. But moving forward now, other states, of course, have their primary elections that are still taking place. Do you think that we'll see maybe them postpone their elections, do similar type of things, acknowledging the backlash that Wisconsin is getting right now?
Well, hopefully the Democratic Party primaries can be either postponed or canceled indefinitely now that Bernie Sanders has suspended his campaign. One thing that really just shocks me, Alex, is why Senator Sanders chose to wait until after last night to suspend his campaign. You know, the math has been against him for several weeks now that he was not going to get the nomination, but he chose to allow yesterday to go on and some of his supporters to go to the polls during a pandemic rather than call it quits before that. That makes no sense to me, and I hope that future states kind of take that as a lesson to cancel their Democratic primaries or at least postpone them, or if anything, and then for actual official elections outside of the party, we've got to do something different clearly, whether that means making absentee ballots more accessible, whether that means different hygiene standards at the polling places. We have to have some sort of solution. I can't imagine being a state official in another state, watching what happened last night in Wisconsin and thinking that I don't want to do everything in my power to make sure that doesn't happen again.
And that'll especially be bad if we see in a couple of days that there's an uptick in coronavirus cases in Wisconsin due to these hundreds of thousands of people turning out to the same facilities in crowded numbers, violating social distancing guidelines, really at the direction of the government to some degree. I mean, they were told to come out, they'd be okay, and they were all right to vote. So if there's an uptick, I think that we're going to see fingers being pointed at those same individuals. But as you mentioned, Senator Bernie Sanders did drop out of this race. Joe Biden is now the presumptive nominee. What does this mean for Biden? Are we going to see very little of him leading up to the general election? Or what does this mean for the Biden campaign and how they maneuver moving forward?
Well, it's good news for the Biden campaign, though it's certainly an overdue development, to say the least. And it's also good news for the country. You know, no matter what happens in November, we're not going to have a socialist president in the White House now that Sanders has officially called it quits. If you're like me, you sure think that that's a good thing for the future of America. But what it also means for this campaign is that it's finally become the Biden versus Trump showdown that we've expected all along. And it's also no longer, I think, originally before the coronavirus, before Sanders dropped out, the election was going to be a referee on socialism and the economy. Well, now that the economy is taking a nosedive and the Sanders is out of the race, it's not going to be that. It's going to be about something else, whether it's the fight against China and being tough on China, or whether it's trade. It's going to be about something else. It's no longer, I think, going to be a battle between socialism versus anti-socialism. So it's really shaken up the race as we known it. And what it means for Joe Biden remains to be seen, but he's got a very tight rope to walk now, trying to appeal to Bernie Sanders supporters without isolating the establishment base.
I think it's really interesting, too, because if you look back at 2016, you could argue that that was a referendum on neoliberalism and the Obama administration, especially in the Beltway, such as Wisconsin, Michigan, the states that we saw vote just recently. And now to see the Democratic Party nominate a guy who is a continuation of both of those things is really interesting. It kind of insinuates to me that maybe the environment and the landscape of this political election is a little bit different than it was in 2016. But as you were saying, now we know the matchup. Only time will tell moving forward. Brad Polumbo, thank you very much for joining us tonight.